Northern France. A clear morning in the spring of 1942. The sky is the pale, hard blue you only see at the very top of the world, and it is bitterly cold. A German fighter pilot is climbing. He is not a novice. He has flown since before the war. He has more than 100 combat sorties behind him, an iron cross on his tunic, and a reputation in his squadron as one of the best pairs of eyes they have. When the ground controllers call a difficult contact, they call him. This morning they have called him for something strange. There is a single aircraft over the coast, very high, holding a dead straight line, no bombers around it, no escort, one machine, alone, going nowhere in particular and everywhere at once. He watches the altimeter crawl. 30,000 feet. And still, above him, that single aircraft sits there, unhurried, trailing a thin white line of vapour across the roof of Europe. He knows the shape. Every German pilot knows the shape. Elliptical wings, that unmistakable silhouette. It is a Spitfire, the most dangerous single-seat fighter the British own, but something is wrong with it. He's close enough now, straining at the very ceiling of his own machine, to see that the wings are clean, smooth. There are no gun ports along the leading edges, no cannon, nothing at all. And the colour is wrong. It is not the dirty green and grey of a fighter. It is a strange, soft, powdery blue, so that when he loses it for a moment against the light, he cannot find it again. He does everything he was ever taught. He trades a little height for speed and tries to zoom up beneath it. He nurses the throttle. He hangs on the propeller until the airframe shudders and warns him it is about to fall out of the sky. It is not enough. It is never enough. The blue aircraft simply opens the distance and climbs away, calm as a man walking upstairs, until it is a speck, and then nothing. He goes home with empty film and an empty logbook entry. And he will not be the last. Pause on that for a moment. The finest fighter pilots in one of the finest air forces the world had ever built, sent up again and again to catch a Spitfire, and they cannot do it. Not because it outfights them, because it refuses to fight them at all. This is not a story about a fighter plane. This is a story about a camera, and about the man who looked at the most famous warplane of the century and decided its best weapon was no weapon at all. Part 1. To understand why they kept failing, you have to understand what they thought they were looking at. And to understand that, we need to go back, not to the Spitfires of the Battle of Britain, but to the war their fathers had fought, the one in which the whole idea of looking at the enemy from the air was born. In the First War, reconnaissance was a slow and dangerous trade. A two-seat biplane would lumber over the trenches, an observer leaning out into the freezing slipstream with a heavy plate camera, changing glass negatives by hand with numb fingers. These machines were slow because they had to be steady. They flew low because the cameras were crude, and because they were slow and low, they were easy to bring down, so they needed fighters to escort them, and drew fighters to hunt them. Reconnaissance meant a crowd. It meant a formation. It meant something an enemy could see coming, and yet, for all its danger, it worked. By 1918, the trench maps that told the artillery where to aim were drawn almost entirely from photographs taken in the air. Every army in Europe came out of that war knowing that the camera aloft was now a weapon, and knowing too exactly what such a camera looked like. Slow, low, escorted. That lesson sank deep into every air force in Europe, and the German Air Force learned it as well as anyone. By 1940, their system of air defence was one of the most sophisticated on Earth. A chain of radar stations along the coast, sets they called Freya and Würzburg, watching for the first hint of an approaching raid. Ground controllers plotting every track on a great map table. Fighter squadrons held at readiness to climb and meet whatever came, guided onto the target by a calm voice on the radio. That system was built to solve one problem: armed intruders, bombers coming to drop their loads, fighters coming to clear the way, and it rested on a simple, reasonable assumption that anything crossing the coast in daylight had come to do harm, and that harm meant weight. Bombs, guns, armour, and the fuel to fight. A warplane was a heavy thing, and heavy things are slow to reach the top of the sky. Consider the arithmetic of interception as they understood it. A fighter warned by radar had perhaps 15 or 20 minutes to climb before an intruder crossed its stretch of coast. In that time, a Messerschmitt clawing upward at full power could reach the height of a bomber stream and still have the energy left to attack. The whole thing was a clock, and the defender, forewarned and climbing light, was meant to win the race against it every time. And there was a second, quieter reason those early reports were brushed aside. A lone aircraft, however high, dropped no bombs. It killed no one and broke nothing on the ground that afternoon. To a hard-pressed controller with real threats to manage, a single machine crossing the coast and leaving again was simply not worth the fuel and the risk of scrambling a whole squadron after it. There was also a matter of pride. To admit that one enemy aircraft could cross the coast, photograph whatever it pleased, and leave again untouched was to admit a hole in the middle of a defence they had spent years and fortunes perfecting. It is a very human thing, in any large organisation, to explain away the report that says the impossible is happening. Here is the part that matters. Their assumption was not stupid. It was correct, for almost everything they had ever met. A loaded bomber was slow, a fighter carrying 8 machine guns and the armour to survive a dogfight was slow to climb and sluggish when it got there. The German controllers carried a mental picture of the enemy, and inside that picture, altitude was a race the defender would usually win, and against a Spitfire of all things they were certain of it. They had fought Spitfires over Dunkirk. They had fought them over Kent and Sussex through the long summer of 1940. They knew exactly what a Spitfire was, a lethal, gun-heavy interceptor, and they knew its limits, because they had pushed it to those limits in combat, and some of them had lived to describe it. So when the reports began to arrive of a Spitfire that climbed clean past the ceiling of their best fighters, that flew straight and level deep over occupied territory and then simply vanished, the reports did not fit. The men who read them assumed a mistake, a bad height estimate, one exceptional pilot, a trick of the radar. After the war, one of the Luftwaffe's most senior fighter leaders, Adolf Galland, wrote frankly in his memoir about how that comfortable arithmetic came apart as the years went on, how the German fighter arm found itself outclimbed and outranged by machines it could see and could not reach. But in these first years the confidence was total. They were right about the aircraft they knew. They were simply chasing a different one. Because the Spitfire they had met in the Battle of Britain and the Spitfire now drawing lines across their sky were the same design and almost entirely different machines. One was built to end other aircraft. The other had been taken apart in a quiet hangar in England by a man most of them had never heard of, and rebuilt to do something their whole model had no answer for. Their air defence was a magnificent instrument for catching things that came to fight. It had one flaw. It could not catch something that came only to look. Part 2. The man in the hangar was named Sidney Cotton, and almost nothing about him fitted the Royal Air Force he ended up serving. He was Australian, born on a cattle station in Queensland in 1894. He had flown with the Royal Naval Air Service in the First War, then spent the 1920s and 30s as a restless, brilliant, difficult businessman, a barnstormer, an inventor, a man who chased seal hunts across Newfoundland and colour film patents across Europe. He was charming, arrogant, allergic to authority, and completely fearless. He was, in short, exactly the wrong sort of person for a peacetime air force, and exactly the right sort for the job he was about to be handed. In the last uneasy months of peace, British intelligence had a problem. They needed to know what Germany was building, the airfields, the shipyards, the factories, and they could not simply fly over and look. So the Secret Intelligence Service, the organisation the public would later call MI6, turned to a civilian who could go where no uniform could. They set Cotton up with a front company, a colour film business, and a sleek American aircraft, a Lockheed 12A, a fast little airliner that could pass anywhere as a rich man's private plane. Hidden in its belly were cameras tucked behind sliding panels that opened only when he was over something worth photographing. He flew across Germany in plain sight, a genial businessman about his business, and brought home images of the very sites the German High Command believed were secret. By some accounts, he even carried German officials as passengers, chatting pleasantly while his cameras ran quietly beneath their feet. He operated from an airfield at Heston, on the western edge of London, and from there his small secret outfit ranged out across the naval bases and factory towns of the German coast. The unit went by deliberately dull names, a flight here, a development unit there, anything that would not draw a second glance on paper. There is a story, and Cotton told it well, that on the very eve of war his was among the last civilian aircraft to lift out of Berlin before the frontier slammed shut, the cameras still hidden in the belly. Whatever the exact truth of that night, the record he had built in those final months of peace was real, and it was better than anything the service possessed of its own. Cotton learned 2 things on those flights that would matter enormously. The first was that you could photograph a whole country from a single unarmed aircraft if it was fast enough and high enough and drew no attention to itself. The second was that when war came, the Royal Air Force was going about it entirely the wrong way. When war broke out in September 1939, the Air Force's own reconnaissance machines were being shot down almost as fast as they could be sent. They were flying slow, obvious aircraft low over the front, and losing them at a rate no service could sustain. Cotton, now given a uniform and the acting rank of wing commander, was allowed to try it his way. His way began with a Spitfire and a simple, almost heretical idea. Take the fastest fighter Britain had and strip out everything that made it a fighter. Out came the 8 machine guns, out came the ammunition boxes, out came the armour plate behind the seat, the bullet-resistant windscreen, every fitting that added weight or drag and had nothing to do with speed. Where the guns had been, in the wings, His engineers fitted extra fuel tanks so the aircraft could reach deep into Germany and come home again. Into the fuselage behind the pilot went the cameras, angled down through the floor, with warm air ducted around them so their shutters would not freeze solid in the killing cold above 40,000 feet, where the temperature falls past minus 50 degrees Celsius. Then came the part that sounds trivial and was not. They filled every joint, every rivet line, every seam in the skin with a special paste, rubbed the whole surface down until it was smooth as glass, and polished it. On an ordinary fighter, a rough skin costs you a few miles an hour no one cares about. On an aircraft whose entire job was to outrun the world, those few miles an hour were the margin between coming home and not. The men who did it invented a word for the whole process. They called it cottonizing. Cotton and his engineers were just as inventive about the cameras themselves. Rather than a single lens pointing straight down, they mounted a fan of cameras set at slight angles, so that one pass could sweep a broad band of ground at once, a wide corridor of country captured in a single straight run. It meant a pilot did not have to loiter and circle over a target, the most dangerous thing he could possibly do. He could fly straight through, fast and high, photographing everything beneath his track, and be gone before anyone on the ground had finished reaching for the telephone. At last they painted it. Not in war colours, but in a soft duck-egg blue, a shade found by patient trial and error to dissolve into the high haze. Later there was a pink, for flying at dawn and dusk against cloud, but the blue was the one the Germans came to know and to dread, the colour that hung above their fighters and would not come down. The result was not a fighter that had lost its guns, it was not a bomber, and it was not a trainer. It was something genuinely new, an aircraft built for one purpose only, to see. Lightened, cleaned and stretched, it could fly higher and faster than the fighter it was born from, and far higher and faster than anything the enemy could send to stop it. It went out alone, with empty gun bays and no armour and not a friend in the sky, trusting to three things and three things only: height, speed and nerve. When one of these machines first went out over enemy territory in the winter of 1939 and came home with clean, usable photographs, where the regular squadrons had been coming home with nothing, or not coming home at all, the argument was effectively over. But the price the pilot paid was severe. He flew for hours at a height where a man cannot breathe without bottled oxygen, wrapped against a cold that could freeze the sweat on his back, hunched alone in a cramped cockpit, navigating by map and watch and dead reckoning across hundreds of miles of hostile country, with no gunner behind him and no voice in his ear. To fly a reconnaissance sortie was to be, for several hours, the loneliest man in the war. Consider one morning that shows exactly what these aircraft could do. On the 21st of May, 1941, a young pilot named Michael Suckling took off from Wick, at the far north of Scotland, in one of these blue Spitfires. Everyone called him Babe for his boyish face. His task was to photograph the Norwegian coast, where German warships were rumoured to be gathering. High over a fjord near Bergen, alone, unarmed, thousands of feet above the reach of the flak, he tripped his cameras and turned for home. When his film was developed, and the interpreters put a magnifying glass to it, they found, sitting in the still grey water, the unmistakable outline of a battleship. It was the Bismarck, the most powerful warship Germany had ever built, caught in the open with her heavy cruiser beside her. Suckling grasped what he had at once, and rushed the prints south through the night to get them into the right hands. That single strip of film set in motion one of the most famous naval chases in all of history. The Royal Navy now knew the great ship had sailed. Everything that followed, the pursuit across the Atlantic, the running battle, the end that came for the Bismarck far out in the ocean, began with one unarmed aircraft and one roll of film. A camera had done what no battleship could. It had found her. Babe Suckling was lost only weeks later, that same summer, on another sortie from which he never returned. To the German Navy, this was something close to sorcery. Their capital ships had been found by an aircraft they never saw and could not have caught. Men flew those missions knowing that if the engine faltered, if the oxygen failed, if some rare fighter did claw its way up, there would be no gun to answer with, no wingman and no rescue, only a long fall over enemy country. If any of that lands with you, a quiet tap of the like button helps keep the memory of young men flying alone at the edge of the sky in the light a little longer. It costs nothing, and it matters more than it should. Part 3. It is one thing to strip an aircraft down. It is another to have an aircraft worth stripping in the first place. And this is where the story stops being about one clever man and becomes about something much larger. The reason Britain, and only Britain, could put a camera that high and keep it there. The secret was in the engine, and in the quiet, unglamorous work of teaching an engine to breathe where there is almost nothing to breathe. At the top of the sky the air is thin to the point of uselessness. An ordinary engine, starved of oxygen, loses power and dies. But the Rolls-Royce Merlin that powered the Spitfire, and later the larger and more powerful Griffon, were fitted with superchargers, in the finest versions 2-stage superchargers, which squeezed that thin high air back into something an engine could actually burn. It was a triumph of metallurgy and patient design, years and years of it, and it meant a British aircraft could still pull hard in air where a German fighter was gasping, mushing and ready to stall out of the sky. That single fact is the hinge of this entire story, so let me give it to you plainly, once. A photographic reconnaissance Spitfire cruised its missions above 40,000 feet, and the finest marks could reach beyond 43,000. The best fighters the Luftwaffe sent up to stop it, the Messerschmitt 109 and the Focke-Wulf 190, ran out of usable sky several thousand feet below that line. By the time an interceptor had dragged itself to its own absolute limit, the blue Spitfire was still climbing, still gaining speed, cruising through air the German pilot could not even hold his aircraft level in. The gap between them was not a matter of nerve or skill. It was a wall, built of engineering, and the German fighter arm never found a way over it. And it was not only the engine, the airframe, the fuel, the oxygen, the cameras, even the very latest marks with their pressurized cabins that let a pilot think clearly in air that would otherwise steal his senses. All of it had to be pushed to the edge together. Britain had spent the 1930s quietly winning 100 small engineering arguments, and the reconnaissance Spitfire was where all of those small victories added up into one the enemy could not answer. Read that idea again, because it is the whole paradox in a single line. The most famous fighter of the war did its most important work by flying to a place where fighting was impossible. Range mattered as much as height, with fuel where the guns had been, and more of it behind the pilot. These aircraft could reach targets the Germans assumed were simply too far inland to be seen. Factories deep in the heart of the country, cities near the eastern frontier, if you want the next chapter, and there are many of them, more machines, more men, more quiet acts of genius that changed the war and were then half forgotten, then subscribe and stay with me. These names should not be allowed to disappear. That, in the end, is the only real reason to tell it at all.